Hi, Alan Sides back one more time, and for another question. This is from Vehi Minikin, and I hope that pronunciation was correct. Do you have a go-to overhead setup for rock drums? Do you keep the kick and snare centered in the overheads, or do you focus on cymbals? I always have placement issues, and it never sounds right. Anyway, here's my thoughts on that one. When I'm recording drums, let's say talk about rock and roll, I do a lot of rock and roll tracks. My typical setup is I'll have a pair of original AKG C12s over the drums. Now, I could also have a pair of simple AKG 451s in the same place. You don't have to have, $36,000 worth of tube mics. You can do just fine with a pair of 451s. So, the point being is, I think of the overhead mics as not just cymbal mics, but overall drum mics. The thing is that if those microphones are too far apart and they're aimed at the cymbals, then they do nothing to make the kit bigger. They're only cymbal mics. And some people will put them like kind of on the cymbals and they'll actually roll off all the low end. The problem is if you have a great pair of overhead microphones, and say, I typically, my mics are probably about 1 foot apart, sitting over the drummer's head, aimed at the cymbals. But yes, the center and the kick are even between the microphones, roughly even. So if I pull up just those two mics alone, I get a really great pickup of the entire kit. I mean, I'm certainly getting more cymbals than toms, but I'm getting the sound of the toms and everything else. Now, if I was using mics like Sennheiser 421s on the toms, so I have one 420 on each tom, the 421 is still not a bad sounding tom mic. The problem with it, its off-axis response is not particularly pretty. What I mean by that is, you get a good snappy tom sound, but the pickup of the hi-hat and the snare off-axis is not that great. So if you have a set of overheads that are just on the cymbals, they're not really overhead, they're not overall kit mics, because the problem is, if you bring those up and they're too close to cymbals, you can't really get the whole aura of the kit. You need to have the mics back further so you get the sound of the toms. So say you're using 421s, one each tom, and you've got these two overhead mics, so you balance out the toms, they're all even across the spread, and then you bring in these overheads, and all of a sudden the toms sound twice as good, because the overheads are giving you this air and space that the 421s don't give you. They give you initial attack, but they won't give you all this air. So the question about are these cymbal mics? No, to me it's an overall kit. They do cover the cymbals, but it's the overall sound of the kit, and I think it's incredibly important. And a lot of times when I mix stuff and it's mic'd the other way where they're right on the cymbals, I really have a very difficult time making it sound the way I want it to sound. Then for me, most of the time for toms, if it's 4 toms, I typically actually use only 2 microphones. I use an AKG C12A right between the center of the first 2 toms, and then one more between the bottom 2 toms. Now, I like the sound of the C12A because it's, compared to say the 421, it's got this, it's a bigger, fatter sound, but it does got a lot more leakage of the rest of the kit. So after I record the entire track, I'll typically go in and drop the level, or I'll raise the level of the toms, say 6 dB in reference to everything else, so that the noise drops 6 dB. And then it sounds fine. It sounds more like the 421s in regard to the rejection noise of the thing, but also the quality of the off-axis performance of C12As is much better. Now, I could use a microphone like a 47 FET. I could even use an 87. There are all kinds of mics I could use, just use 2 mics. I like the less mics you have, generally speaking, the better it sounds, but it requires a little finessing. In regards to the snare, typically what I'm doing is, usually something simple like an SM57 on top of the snare. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I might put a 451 with a 20 dB pad right next to it and have 2 mics. I might pick either or. But typically what I do that's different is I usually have a pair of microphones under the snare in stereo. I usually use Sony C55Ps, but I could use, once again, a pair of 451s with 20 pads under the snare, and it just adds, having a stereo under snare adds so much crunch and clarity to the sound of the snare, rather than just a single mono under snare mic. And of course I'm using condensers because I want all that nice crisp highs. The 57 is still pretty hard to beat. It's got lots of punch and impact, and if it's sitting in just the right spot, and then you bring in the under snare mics, it's pretty juicy sounding, it's really pretty good. In regards to kick, typically what I'm using is, I usually use a D112 inside the kick, usually maybe about 6 to 8 inches from the head, aimed at the beater inside. And then I'll put a U47 FET on the outside with a windscreen. And I will usually run both kick mics through a Neve 1073 because I love the shelving of the 1073. It actually sounds really nice in the kick. So typically, like on the 47 FET, I'm going to need a little bit more EQ. So probably I'll add a little bit of 33 hertz usually. Depends what's going on. I'm a low bass guy, and then I will probably add. I might add some of this shelf. I could probably add 6 dB at the 12K shelf, and that sounds kind of crazy, but it adds air without tick. And then I'll maybe add a little 3K broadband to that outer mic. The inner mic, a lot of times I won't add any EQ at all. I just kind of combine the two, and that's what I do for bass drum. Then typically I'll also have a set of room mics, 1 pair, maybe 2 pairs, depends. A lot of times I'll put up a pair of M50s for my room mics, maybe, it could be a 12 feet away to 20 feet away from the drums, depending upon how much ambience I'm looking for. The other thing I do a lot, particularly in rock and roll, is I'll take a mult of the overheads and I'll run it through a ADR compact stereo compressor. Now, it's a sidechain. When I say sidechain, meaning that I have 2 parallel paths. I have the overheads untouched, and then I have an overheads ultra compressed pair, and that pair is put on a separate track. And then I can add that back in to the overall kit, and it adds all this floor and sustain, but all my peaks are intact. So, because for me, I'm just a big punch freak. I can't make it punchy enough. I think I said this. Another thing is that I want to expand it, not compress it. But I love the sound of the sustain the compressors gives me, as long as it doesn't destroy the attack. So typically, if I didn't have those sort of microphones, I'd probably just use a pair of 451s in the top. Use 421s in the toms. I'd probably use a KM84 or a 451 on the hi-hat, and 251s on the snare, 57 on top, and the D112 on the kick. And there are the 47 FET's my favorite outside microphone, but using the Yamaha speaker can work pretty good too. The single Yamaha speaker, which you use a thing. The only thing I find is that it's a little late. It actually is a bit late. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll move that after I've recorded. I'll move that closer to the attack of the D112, so that the two line up, because otherwise it you get the attack and then you get the slop afterwards, and I want that low bass stuff from the mic speaker, but I think it sounds better when you move the two closer. Also, if you have a chance, please subscribe to our new YouTube video channel. I'm going to answer a ton of questions. Thanks.